The 2024-2025 Toronto Maple Leafs were first place in the Atlantic Division. They had the experience, talent, and seemingly the grit needed to challenge for the Stanley Cup. So how is it possible that 1 year later they finished fifth last in the NHL and ended up with the first overall 2026 pick? This is the story about how the Toronto Maple Leafs made aggressive philosophical changes that led to a miracle mired with catastrophe. In May 2023, the Toronto Maple Leafs were just eliminated by the eventual Stanley Cup finalists, the Florida Panthers. That loss was their seventh consecutive playoff elimination in the Auston Matthews era. It was determined that philosophically, the Toronto Maple Leafs under analytics guru Kyle Dubas were not built for the physical rigor and nastiness of the playoffs. The Leafs decided to bring in a more traditional hockey person in Brad Treliving. His hiring was widely criticized as he was the man responsible for losing Johnny Gaudreau in free agency and trading future Stanley Cup winner Matthew Tuch in 2022. He was also the man who mismanaged the Sean Monahan situation, trading him at his lowest value to the Montreal Canadiens for a future 2025 16th overall pick. There were clear indicators that the leadership and judgment of Brad Treliving were questionable. After losing once again for the eighth time in the Matthews era to the Boston Bruins in 2024, the Maple Leafs fired Sheldon Keefe and hired former Cup-winning coach Craig Berube. His hiring cemented a clear mandate to shift from a puck possession, up-tempo offensive hockey team to a hard-nosed, gritty, and defensively oriented one. There was one major problem. The coach's job is to implement the best system according to the players you have, and not to force players to play a style their aptitudes are not equipped for. The Maple Leafs roster was constructed to play a high-octane offensive style, not a grinding defensive one. At first, the move appeared to bear fruit as the Maple Leafs finished first place in the Atlantic Division with 108 points in 2024-2025, only 3 back of the Capitals, who finished first in the East. Auston Matthews' role that season shifted to a more defensive one as the percentage of his shifts starting in the defensive zone under Berube shot up by 7%. His PK time also exploded from 43 seconds per game in 2023-2024 under Keefe to 1 minute and 37 seconds per game. That amount slightly dipped during the 2025-2026 season with 1 minute and 10 seconds. But the point remains. Berube used Matthews against the opposing top lines more often than ever before in his career, asked him to come lower in the defensive zone to support the defense, and had him dumping in pucks more often. These changes in how Matthews was used was by design. The Maple Leafs wanted to play a heavier and more responsible style to go further in the playoffs. Poised for a 9th consecutive playoff appearance and with pressure to win at an all-time high, the Maple Leafs made a huge gambit. With virtually zero salary cap space, the Leafs aimed to acquire players who would better suit the style Berube wanted to play. To do so, they acquired center Scott Laughton from the Philadelphia Flyers and 6'5" right-handed defenseman Brandon Carlo from the Boston Bruins. It partially worked, as the 2024-2025 Maple Leafs got to the second round, eventually losing in a controversial series against the eventual Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers. However, these trades would prove to be absolutely catastrophic in the near future. The Scott Laughton trade occurred first on March 7, 2025, at around 1 p.m. In that deal, the Maple Leafs sent a conditional 2027 first-round pick to the Flyers. The condition was that if the pick is outside the top 10, the Flyers automatically receive the Leafs' 2027 pick. However, if it is in the top 10, the Leafs must send the Flyers their unprotected 2028 pick. 2 hours later, the Leafs completed what would become a devastating miscalculation. They traded promising center prospect Fraser Minton and a top 5 protected 2026 first-round pick to the Boston Bruins for Brandon Carlo. Here's the wrinkle. Because of the earlier Laughton trade, the Leafs could not guarantee the Bruins their 2027 first-rounder if the 2026 pick ended up in the top 5, which ended up happening when the Leafs won the 2026 lottery. More on that later. To convince the Bruins this would not be a problem, they added the condition that if the 2026 and 2027 picks were not available, that the Bruins would receive their 2028 first-round pick unprotected. The 2025 second-round loss to the Panthers triggered another monumental meltdown by the sensationalist media and the emotionally distraught fan base, causing hometown star winger Mitch Marner to be harassed in the media, on social media, and most disgustingly, at his physical properties. Marner, who was a pending unrestricted free agent, informed the Maple Leafs that he could no longer tolerate the abuse and informed the team he would be leaving for the Vegas Golden Knights. To facilitate the move and manage the fallout, the Maple Leafs traded Marner to the Golden Knights for bottom six center Nicolas Roy. The loss of Marner and the Maple Leafs' inability to replace him was an enormous step back for the Maple Leafs. The 2025-2026 Maple Leafs struggled. Auston Matthews had a career-worst 27 goals on a career-low 11.9 shooting percentage. Matthews also had a sharp decline in shooting velocity and skating speed. The loss of playmaking dynamo Mitch Marner certainly did not help. As of May 2026, this is where we are. The Toronto Maple Leafs finished fifth last in the NHL, fired Brad Treliving, and hired disgraced John Chayka, as well as Leafs legend Matt Sundin as their management team, and miraculously won the 2026 NHL Draft Lottery and will select first overall at the 2026 NHL Draft. As a result of keeping their 2026 pick, this is the situation. If the Leafs' 2027 first-round pick is outside the top 10, the Flyers automatically get the pick, and the Bruins receive the 2028 unprotected Leafs first. However, if the 2027 Leafs first is inside the top 10, the Leafs choose which team gets the 2027 first and which team gets the 2028 unprotected first. We can assume that the Leafs would choose the Flyers to get the 2028 unprotected first and not their rivals, the Boston Bruins. On March 31st, Leafs CEO Keefe met the media and discussed the Brad Treliving firing and GM search. He indicated that the team does not intend to rebuild and that Auston Matthews is a generational and foundational piece. Pelly may want to keep Auston Matthews, but he is only signed for 2 more seasons, and sources indicated to Chris Johnston that Matthews needs to see an improvement to the roster before committing to another season with the Toronto Maple Leafs. That was, of course, merely hours before the Maple Leafs won the 2026 NHL Draft Lottery and will have the chance at someone like Gavin McKenna or Ivar Stenberg. The Maple Leafs have very few internal assets to play with in their organization, save Easton Cowan, Dennis Hildeby, and Ben Danford. They have an aging, slow, and flawed roster. They are at a proverbial crossroads. If they decide to compete in an attempt to make the playoffs over the next 2 years of Matthews' remaining term, they risk being mediocre and forfeiting high draft picks to the Flyers and Bruins. And if they trade away players like Matthews, Nyes, or Nylander, they may accumulate young assets and build around their 2026 first overall pick, but then risk forfeiting lottery-level picks in 2027 and 2028 to the Flyers and Bruins. So what is the next step? The Maple Leafs are at a fork in the road and have but 2 options. Option 1. The Maple Leafs have a projected $22 million in cap space this summer. If they draft Gavin McKenna or Ivar Stenberg, they will ostensibly replace much of the offensive output they lost in Mitch Marner. But Matthews has stated he wants to see roster upgrades. One possibility is going after 70-point D-man and Toronto native Darren Raddysh. The Tampa Bay Lightning likely will be unable to re-sign him, considering the upcoming Nikita Kucherov contract situation. Another could be throwing everything at Alex Tuch. It is likely in the Maple Leafs' best interest to try and be competitive, considering their 2027 and 2028 first-round picks do not belong to them and are essentially unprotected. Easier said than done. Option 2. Try and start fresh with their future first overall pick. Trade one or all 3 of Matthews, Nyes, and Nylander for younger, promising players and assets with control. In doing so, they could try and compete using our young and enthusiastic roster with an underdog mentality. The hope would be to start a new team culture and pray their 2027 and 2028 picks do not end up being lottery picks. It is clear that the baggage of 9 playoff losses and 1 missed postseason in the media circus of Toronto has become cumbersome and heavy on the longtime Maple Leafs core. One of the famed core 4 already jumped ship in Marner. Perhaps it is best for the Maple Leafs to make a proactive decision and start fresh, especially if Captain Auston Matthews has already expressed his desire to do so. But is it too risky for the Maple Leafs organization? What do you think? Will the Maple Leafs triple down on Matthews and Nylander or rebuild around their future first overall pick?